Western Australia sits at the edge of the world. Most people know it for the mining boom, the endless red dirt, the isolation that makes other isolated places feel crowded by comparison. What most people do not know is that scattered across the landscape surrounding Perth, there are structures, formations, and sites that have been sitting in the ground and on the surface for longer than anyone has been able to satisfactorily explain. Not mysteries in the television sense. Not fabricated controversies designed to sell documentaries. Genuine anomalies that archaeologists, geologists, and historians have examined carefully and walked away from with more questions than they arrived with. Some of these sites challenge the accepted timeline of human settlement in Australia. Some challenge what we think we know about the technical capabilities of ancient peoples. Some have no convincing explanation at all from any discipline, using any framework currently available to mainstream science. 11 of them sit within reach of Perth. 11 structures, formations, and sites that the tour buses do not stop at, that the official visitor guides do not feature, and that a significant number of researchers believe deserve far more serious attention than the academic mainstream has been willing to give them. This is the full account of each one. What exists, what has been found, what has been proposed, and what remains genuinely, stubbornly unresolved. If this kind of content is what you have been looking for, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover the unexplained corners of Australia that the standard history leaves out. Now let us get into the sites. Number 1. The Moora stone arrangements. Several hours north of Perth, in the Wheatbelt region near the town of Moora, a series of stone arrangements sits on cleared agricultural land that has been farmed for over a century. The arrangements were documented by amateur researchers in the early 2000s and have received intermittent academic attention since. What makes them difficult to categorize is their scale and their geometry. The stones themselves are sandstone and laterite pieces of modest size, the kind of material readily available across the Western Australian wheatbelt. What is remarkable is how they are positioned. Certain arrangements form near-perfect geometric configurations, including what appears to be a consistent angular alignment that researchers have attempted to connect to astronomical events, specifically solstice sunrise and sunset positions from the latitude of Moora. The alignments have not been formally confirmed by any institution. That absence cuts both ways. It does not confirm the alignments are significant, but it also means nobody has done the work to rule them out. Dating stone arrangements in a dry climate environment without organic material in direct association is extremely difficult. Attempts to use weathering profiles to estimate exposure age have produced ranges too wide to be conclusive. What can be said is that the formations predate European farming of the land, because the farmer who first cleared portions of the paddocks noted the stones and worked around them deliberately. The oral tradition of the local Ued people, whose country this land sits within, contains references to stone arrangements used for ceremony, for navigation, and for the marking of seasonal events. Whether these specific arrangements connect to that tradition has not been formally established, in part because the research process has not been pursued with the resources and community consultation it would require. What sits in those paddocks north of Moora is a set of formations that cannot currently be explained with confidence, that predate the historical record, and that have been sitting quietly in agricultural land while the institutions capable of resolving the question have been occupied elsewhere. Number 2. The Wandjina cave paintings of the Kimberley Fringe. The full Wandjina tradition belongs to the Kimberley, which is a long way north of Perth. But the fringe of the Wandjina cultural territory extends into regions that bring these extraordinary rock art figures within the scope of any honest account of inexplicable ancient Western Australian sites. They deserve to be on this list because the questions they generate are genuinely unresolved and genuinely significant. The Wandjina figures are large, Some exceed 2 meters in height. They are painted in ochre, white and black, on sandstone surfaces across the Kimberley, and their visual vocabulary is unlike any other rock art tradition anywhere in the world. The figures have large, rounded heads with no mouths. They have large, dark oval eyes. They are surrounded by radiating lines that most researchers interpret as representations of clouds or rain, reflecting the Wandjina's role as rain-bringing sky beings in Woonambal, Ngarinyaan, and Warora cosmology. What makes them inexplicable in the strict sense is their age combined with their complexity. Uranium-thorium dating of calcium carbonate crusts overlying some Kimberley rock art has produced dates exceeding 17,000 years. If the Wandjina figures are among the oldest layers of that art, which some researchers argue on stylistic grounds, they represent figurative painting of extraordinary sophistication from a period so remote that conventional archaeology struggles to process what that implies. The further inexplicable element is the ongoing nature of the tradition. Living senior custodians of Wandjina country continue to repaint and maintain the figures as a living ritual practice. They are not merely historical artifacts, they are living presences, still tended by communities whose connection to them is unbroken across an expanse of time that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. What you cannot explain with confidence is the origin of a figurative painting tradition this complex at this age, on this continent, with no parallel anywhere in the world from the same period. Number 3. The Cervantes Dolmen Formation. Near Cervantes, on the Turquoise Coast, roughly 250 kilometers north of Perth, a formation of large limestone blocks sits in a configuration that a number of researchers have described using the term dolmen, a word applied in European archaeology to megalithic portal structures typically associated with Neolithic burial chambers. The claim is contested. The mainstream geological position is that the formation is a natural result of differential weathering in the coastal limestone karst, where horizontal bedding planes and vertical joints create apparently structured formations through entirely natural erosion processes. The pinnacles just south of Cervantes are the most famous example of what limestone karst processes can produce in this region. But the Cervantes formation is different in character from the pinnacles. It consists of a small number of very large slabs positioned in a way that several researchers argue could not have resulted from in situ weathering processes. One slab in particular appears to be resting on smaller stones in a configuration that would be described as deliberate placement if found in a European context. The difficulty is that Australia's archaeological record for the period in which such structures would have been created in Europe does not include a known tradition of megalithic construction. That absence has been used to dismiss the formation as a natural feature that pattern-seeking humans have misread. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and new sites continue to challenge established timelines regularly enough that the argument from absence carries less weight than it once did. What sits near Cervantes is a limestone formation that has not been explained to the complete satisfaction of everyone who has examined it, that resembles megalithic construction in ways that are difficult to entirely dismiss, and that exist in a region where the karst geology makes the natural formation argument genuinely available. The question remains open. Number 4. The Gnamma holes of the Perth Hills. Across the granite outcrops of the Darling Range, east of Perth, there are thousands of Gnamma holes, natural depressions in granite rock that collect rainwater and have been used by Aboriginal peoples across the arid and semi-arid zones of Australia for tens of thousands of years. Most Gnamma holes are clearly natural, but certain Gnamma holes in the Perth Hills present features that natural weathering processes do not comfortably account for. These include holes with near-perfectly circular cross-sections maintained at consistent diameter through considerable depth, holes with what appear to be deliberately smoothed rims and walls, and holes occurring in clusters with spatial relationships that suggest deliberate planning rather than random erosion. A researcher at a Western Australian university documented a series of unusual Gnamma holes in the Jarrahdale area in the early 2010s. The documentation noted wall geometries that appeared to involve deliberate modification, including what looked like tool marks at a consistency that natural fracture patterns do not typically produce. The report was published in a minor regional journal and received no institutional follow-up. The water storage interpretation is the most practical explanation. Communities managing water across a landscape where surface water is seasonally absent would have strong motivation to deepen and smooth existing natural depressions. This is consistent with known Aboriginal water management practices documented across Australia. What it does not explain is the precision of certain modifications, or the apparent relationships between hole positions in some clusters that several observers have suggested cannot be adequately explained by functional water management logic alone. The Gnamma holes of the Perth Hills are not individually inexplicable. What is difficult to explain is the pattern across the landscape and the complete absence of any research program designed to examine them systematically. Number 5. The Lancelin earthworks. North of Perth, in the coastal sand country near Lancelin, aerial photography and subsequent ground investigation have revealed what appear to be earthwork features extending across a substantial area of sand plain. The features include linear arrangements, possible enclosure outlines, and rectilinear formations that several researchers have argued are inconsistent with natural dune formation processes. The coastal sand plain north of Perth is one of the most dynamically changing landscapes in the region. Dunes migrate, blow out, reform, and stabilize over timescales of decades to centuries, making the Lancelin area a genuinely difficult environment for identifying ancient surface features. The earthwork interpretations were first suggested by a hobby researcher who noticed the formations in publicly available aerial imagery. Professional archaeologists who reviewed the imagery expressed skepticism, citing the sand plain's natural dynamics as sufficient to produce linear and rectilinear surface features without human agency. The counter-argument is that certain features maintain consistent orientation across areas large enough that random dune dynamics would be expected to produce a variety of orientations rather than the alignments observed. No excavation or coring program has been conducted at the Lancelin site. Without subsurface investigation, the question of whether the surface features reflect buried structures of human origin cannot be resolved. The site sits on land with complex tenure, identified as a barrier to investigation by researchers who have attempted to move the project forward. What exists near Lancelin are aerial features that have not been satisfactorily explained, in a landscape that could preserve buried evidence of early occupation, in a region where the known history of human presence extends back tens of thousands of years. Number 6. The Kalamunda rock engravings. In the hills east of Perth, in the bush surrounding the suburb of Kalamunda, a series of rock engravings sits on granite surfaces that have been exposed for thousands of years. They are listed in the State Heritage Register and are formally acknowledged as Aboriginal cultural heritage. What makes them inexplicable is not their existence, but their content. Among the engravings are figures and symbols that do not fit comfortably within the documented visual vocabulary of Noongar rock art from this region. Certain engravings have been described as either unusually old in their weathering characteristics, or as representing a symbolic vocabulary for which no comparative examples have been identified in the surrounding region. One specific series attracted attention from a researcher in the 1990s who argued the forms showed stylistic parallels to pre-dynastic Egyptian symbolic writing. This interpretation was not seriously entertained by the mainstream academic community. The problem is that dismissing a poorly framed interpretation does not resolve the underlying question of why certain engravings are difficult to categorize within the established Noongar art tradition. Senior Noongar elders consulted about specific engravings have in some cases acknowledged that the meaning and origin of particular marks are not held within living cultural memory. That acknowledgement is itself significant. Rock art research in Australia has been substantially underfunded for most of the past century. The systematic documentation required to establish what is normal and what is anomalous within any regional tradition has simply not been completed. What the Kalamunda engravings demonstrate is what that underfunding costs in terms of genuine understanding of a human past that is deeper and more complex than current frameworks can fully accommodate. Number 7. The Rottnest Island submerged features. Rottnest Island sits 18 kilometres offshore from Perth, known to most visitors for its quokkas and its beaches. What most visitors do not know is that Rottnest Island was not an island for most of human history on this continent. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 120 metres lower than today. The area that is now Rottnest Island was a hill in a landscape extending many kilometres further west. What is now the seabed between Rottnest and the mainland was dry, habitable, walkable country. Underwater archaeological investigation around Rottnest has produced compelling results. Stone artifacts, including what appear to be worked stone tools, have been recovered from the seabed in waters of varying depth around the island. These artifacts, if confirmed as humanly worked, would represent direct physical evidence of human occupation from periods before sea level rise inundated the area. Marine archaeology in Australian waters is chronically underfunded, and the logistical requirements of conducting systematic underwater survey are beyond the resources of most institutions that have expressed interest in the Rottnest seabed. The people who lived in the landscape, now covered by the water between Rottnest and Fremantle, would have watched that water rise across generations. Their tools are still there, on a seabed above what was once their country. And the full investigation that would tell us who they were has not yet been done. Number 8. The York Standing Stones. Standing in the Avon Valley near the historic town of York, approximately 100 kilometres east of Perth. A collection of standing stones sits in privately held agricultural land. They are standing upright in a landscape where the underlying geology does not produce naturally vertical formations, and their positioning has generated a genuine, if small, research literature. The York Standing Stones were first formally documented in the 1980s by a researcher investigating Aboriginal ceremonial landscapes of the Avon Valley. The documentation noted that the stones appeared to have been placed deliberately, based on their orientation relative to the local terrain and the absence of similar formations in the surrounding paddocks. Several stones showed base modifications consistent with intentional setting into the ground rather than natural emergence through soil processes. Attempts to radiocarbon date organic material in direct association with the stones have been inconclusive. The soil chemistry in the Avon Valley is not favourable for organic preservation over long timescales, and material recovered near the stone bases did not yield dates with usable precision. Noongar cultural knowledge of the Avon Valley is rich and detailed. The valley was a significant corridor for movement and ceremony across the seasons, and the landscape holds layers of meaning that European settlement did little to erase. Whether the York Standing Stones connect to that knowledge has not been formally established through a research process conducted in genuine partnership with Noongar communities. What stands in those paddocks is a group of stones apparently placed deliberately by unknown people at an unknown time for an unknown purpose. What is unusual is how little serious work has been done to change that. Number 9. the Pilbara petroglyphs complex. The Pilbara is a long way north of Perth, but its inclusion in any account of inexplicable ancient Western Australian sites is not optional. The Borit Peninsula, now formally named the Murujuga National Park, contains the largest collection of rock art in the world. Estimates of the number of individual engravings on the peninsula range into the millions. The engravings include representations of animals now extinct, including the thylacine, at a time when it still inhabited the Australian mainland. They include representations of what appear to be human figures in boats, in a region where the current coastline bears no resemblance to the coastline when the oldest engravings were made. And they include figures and symbols for which no confident interpretation has been offered by any researcher working in any tradition. The oldest engravings at Murujuga may be over 40,000 years old. Sitting in front of one of these engravings is an encounter with a depth of human time that very few places on Earth can offer. And most of what those people knew and intended when they made these marks is entirely beyond current recovery. This is a place that humbles every framework we use to understand ancient human life. And it is in Western Australia. Number 10. The Koorda alignment. Near the small agricultural town of Koorda in the wheat belt, a series of surface features was documented in the 1990s by a researcher investigating anomalous landscape patterns across the central wheat belt. The features consist of low earthen ridges and associated stone concentrations forming a linear alignment extending over several kilometers. The alignment was initially interpreted as a stock root feature from the early pastoral period. That interpretation was questioned when closer examination showed the stone concentrations included deeply weathered laterite pieces that did not match recently disturbed surface material. Deeply weathered laterite in this context suggests exposure times measurable in thousands rather than hundreds of years. If the stone concentrations are genuinely ancient, the alignment they form raises questions the pastoral root interpretation cannot answer. A kilometers-long linear alignment of ancient stone concentrations, oriented consistently relative to the landscape, does not fit any known category of Aboriginal site type formally documented in the central wheat belt. The Koorda alignment may represent a site type not yet formally recognized and incorporated into the interpretive framework archaeologists use to assess the region. Alternatively, it may be a natural feature misread by researchers with more enthusiasm than methodology. What cannot be done is close the question entirely without the investigation it requires. Number 11. The Mundaring Weir undercroft carvings. The Mundaring Weir, built in the 1890s as the start of the Goldfields water supply scheme, is one of the great engineering achievements of colonial Western Australia. The pipeline it feeds runs almost 600 kilometres inland to Kalgoorlie, carrying water across dry country that defeated every earlier attempt to sustain the Goldfields population. What is less celebrated is what construction workers reportedly found during the original excavation of the Weir foundations. The accounts come from oral histories collected in the mid-20th century and from written accounts of uncertain provenance circulating in Western Australian local history circles. What they consistently describe is the discovery, during foundation excavation in the granite bedrock, of carved chambers and passage features that did not fit any natural geological formation and that preceded European presence in the region by an undetermined period. The accounts were not taken seriously at the time and have not been the subject of formal investigation. The Weir is now significant heritage infrastructure, and the possibility of excavating beneath it to investigate the reported subsurface features is essentially zero under current heritage management frameworks. What makes the Mundaring accounts worth including rather than dismissing is their consistency across independent sources. The descriptions of carved features in granite bedrock are detailed enough to represent either genuine observation or fabrication requiring a motivation that is difficult to identify. Whether the reported features exist cannot be determined. Whether they will ever be investigated is almost certainly no. And that, in a sense, is the condition of all 11 sites on this list. Not definitively mysterious in the conspiracy sense. Not definitively explained in the mainstream sense. Sitting in a space between what we know and what we have been willing to look at hard enough to find out. Western Australia is an ancient landscape occupied by people whose presence here is so deep in time that our frameworks for understanding it are still being built. The sites on this list are not evidence of hidden civilizations or alien intervention. They are evidence of something more interesting and more humbling than that. They are evidence of how much we do not yet know about the human story on this continent, and how little work has been done to close the distance between what exists in this landscape and what we have managed to understand about it. 11 sites, all within the reach of Perth, all sitting in that gap. If any of these locations caught your attention, tell us in the comments which one and why. If there is a site in Western Australia that belongs on this list that we have not included, that conversation belongs in the comments too. Subscribe if you want to keep following the parts of Australian history that the standard curriculum leaves out. We will see you in the next one.